appreciate it. Yeah, as Chris said, my name is AJ Reyes. I'm an aquatic ecologist and certified lake manager through the North American Lake Management Society. I work for GEI Consultants. And yeah, my job is to be a lake manager. Basically what I do is I assess water bodies, but most often lakes and reservoirs and ponds, assess their ability to be, the best way to put it is assess their ability to be useful to the community while also keeping the ecology intact. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, but lakes are not just these water bodies that sit out there. They're the center point of our communities. They are where our grandparents or grandkids come in and they fish and they swim. That's where memories are built. It's not just a water where you pull a big bass out of it. It sort of permeates everything that you do around that water. So it's really important that that water is usable for the most amount of uses you can have. Obviously an ideal word, swimming, fishing, boating, aesthetics, 4th of July parades, all of those sort of things we love to do on lakes. And part of my job as a lake manager is to look at the science, see what the science is telling us in terms of what the lake is telling us in terms of, is it really, really stressed? Is it in a good place? Is there some problem coming down the road that's going to impact one of these uses that we need to be aware of? All of those sort of things. So I'll get into it in a little bit, but lake management really is a combination of, I'm just gonna highlight it quickly. It's a combination of the science and the sociology of lakes. So I'm just gonna give a few quick slides of just kind of the background of lake management, where my perspective lies on it, kind of where we sit in total in terms of what we're thinking about how we manage lakes. Then we're going to jump into Beaver Dam, some of the testing summary. I'm also going to talk about some of the CSLAP data that's been collected over the years, because that really tells a very important story for us. One thing about the CSLAP, almost every lake that I manage, it's always a struggle to get enough data to be able to make real meaningful changes and meaningful interpretations of stuff. You can't just look at a lake one time or even 2 times or even 3 times. You can't just look at it in 1 year. These lakes are changing constantly. So the fact that there's a wealth of background volunteer data that's been collected is immeasurably valuable. And it's very important to recognize that that's great hard work, and that really helps us. We're not starting from square one. We have a lot more to go, both in the monitoring perspective and the actual action perspective. But I want to acknowledge that that is amazing that you guys have that data, and I would strongly consider, continuing to do that. No lake gets better without good data behind it. That just does not happen. So I just want to acknowledge, everyone on the board who's done that testing in the past and in the future. It's
and if I could just jump in, like that's one of the ways that supports what we have been speaking about, where the function of the board is not this municipal board where we're creating laws and unfortunately speed limits and things like we were talking about before the meeting. But if the board were to go away, what would happen to our lake? And you could just think about that. So if nothing was done to the lake, what color would it be? Would we have a beach? Would we swim in it? Would the animals be here? All that. So those are questions you have to ask yourself. Sorry, go ahead.
No problem. So let's jump right in. So all lakes are dying. Now that's kind of a little bit of a shocking statement, but really when you're talking about lake management, you're managing a water body that is trying to become a wetland, which is trying to become a field, which is trying to become a forest, or potentially it's trying to become a parking lot for a big box store or something like that, right? All lakes are moving towards this point of filling in. Even if it's Lake George, if it's one of these beautiful, pristine Canadian Shield lakes that's got, no paved roads within 30 miles of it, every lake is moving to this point. And it's because lakes are accumulators. They are not flow through systems like rivers are. When sediment comes into a lake, when you have a storm and you see your roads running and it's all chocolate milk, not all that material that you see running down the road is exiting out the dam. It is staying in the lake. Part of it is staying, part of it's going in. So that's a challenge that every lake faces. Now, why is this important for lake management? It's important because the rate of a lake filling in is really impacted by what's going on in the watershed and what sort of on a larger scale what humans are doing to our watersheds. When we like to, when we build roads, when we build homes, when we build industries, schools, anything that we have in our society that, makes our society run in terms of parking lots and all these other things, development, all of those things sort of shorten the lifespan of our lakes. And once again, it's not to say people have done this intentionally. This is just the natural course of, us as humans continuing to build out in our lands and stuff like this. However, it's, not really negotiable, the fact that this has a negative impact on all lakes. Once again, this isn't specific to Beaver Dam. This is every lake that is dealing with this. So most of the time, if you had like an undisturbed large lake that's sitting in a watershed that's mostly forested, which is that blue arrow I have here, it's going to take a really, really long time to sort of fill in. And that's because there's not much coming off the watershed. The soil in the forest is held by all the vegetation there. When you have a massive rainstorm, that soil, that vegetation kind of soaks up that water and slowly releases it out. When you have a more highly developed watershed, this 150-year scenario out here is like, think about if you go to a major metropolitan area, a city, and you have a small retention pond that's in there, right? That can fill up, even 150 years is way too long. It'd probably fill up in 10 years. That's because it's getting all this pressure, all this material that's running in. And it's a direct, once again, a result of us building out in our watersheds, building out in our lands that's impacting, right? So, all right, if your lake fills in 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, why do we care, right? If the lake's fine and we're using it, okay, I'm not gonna be here in the next 67, or in 67 years. Even if my grandkids are probably gonna be gone in, 150 years or whatever the time frame is. So why do we care about this in terms of lake management? Well, we care partially because when this process is happening, it's not all roses when the process is sped up. Think about it like a train, right? So as a train is going along, it's fine. Maybe you have a few bumps here or there, but it's fine. But then the train starts to speed up and it starts to go faster and faster and faster. You're in the cart, it's starting to shake a little bit. You're unsure. I know, for anyone from this area, if you're taking the Hudson line sometimes, down to the city. Exactly.
Changing tracks.
Exactly. You're changing tracks. It's getting all bumpy. It's getting very uncomfortable. And this is very similar to what's happening in lakes. This accelerated filling in is of all the symptoms of, increased algae growth that you're seeing in the lake, increased aquatic plant growth, sedimentation to where maybe you can't get your boat into an area that you normally were able to, or your dock is starting to fill in where you used to be able to dive off to that area, but you can't because there's too much sediment there. The lake is now looking to be, it's brown and green instead of just being clear. All those things are sort of the bumps in the road that become more and more prevalent as, once again, the train goes faster. So the big part with this example I want to bring up is we are all fighting our lakes filling in. You can't reverse it and you can't stop it. But if management is done correctly, what you can do is you can slow it down to the point where you can maximize the use of the water body for all the things we want to use, also keeping the ecology intact, which, sometimes is exactly the same thing, sometimes it's not. But if it's done correctly, you can slow it down and maximize these uses over time. And this is an important sort of, place setting for all of lake management. There's no magic pill to immediately reverse the lake and make it this pristine water body. Beaver Dam Lake is never going to be Lake George. Beaver Dam Lake is never going to be Lake Tahoe. Can it be a lake where people can enjoy the maximum amount that they can throughout the summer? Or lake where, beaches can be open most of the year, where people can swim and not fear for, harmful algae and, the plants are under control. That's certainly within the grasp. So it's about setting expectations, knowing that we're all moving in this one direction, but how do we kind of slow it up to make sure that we're still maximizing everything we can do? So this is basically just a recap of what we were talking about. The idea is slowing down that train, right? Slowing down that process is really the long-term goal. And the way we do this in lake management is try to reduce the materials that create those negative conditions. What fuels the algae? We'll talk about that in a little bit. We want to reduce that. That's fueling the algae. What's fueling the plant growth? Can we reduce that? There are certain things we can't reduce, and we have to talk about those. It's important to understand that. As I mentioned before, the ride becomes increasingly uncomfortable for the patrons that are on the that are on the train, right? There's all those short-term uncomfortable situations. So how do we deal with that? The one different thing I want to point out in this slide and just kind of round this all out is lake management is not long-term and it's not short-term, it's both. And it has to be both. If you just took a complete long-term perspective, the board wouldn't exist. And the management wouldn't exist because you would just say, well, we're working in the watershed and, yeah, it's gonna take 35 years to get everything done. But, we don't really care if the lake looks bad right now, wait until it looks better. Nobody's gonna really buy that, that's not great. And then, once again, you're losing all that base stuff that you love about lakes, right? All the memories of bringing people up, right? So that's why short-term interventions such as, the algicide treatments, the herbicide treatments that happen, that's so important because that still maximizes the use. And then that short-term feeds into the long-term because people see and realize, okay, wow, we had a great year this year. Let's just say, great 2024. We're gonna have. I don't know if we're gonna have a great one, but let's say we have a great 2024. How do we make this more common over time? And that's how you get to the long-term aspect of it, right? So it's not just short-term, it's not just long-term. It's got to be a perspective on all of the entire cycle. So it's important to mention lakes are complicated. There is nothing simple about what is going on out there. Right out there is a immeasurably complex cocktail of chemical, biological, physical, geological processes all happening right now as we speak, and will change daily, will change weekly, will change monthly. Even, limnologists that have been studying lakes for decades and decades and decades, it's still a large black box in terms of what's going on. So recognizing that complexity is really important, right? A lot of people say, well, when it rains, the lake gets better. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. There's 1,000 different factors that drive the way, like, let's say rain affects a water body. On one end, you could say, well, rain is coming in and you're pushing in, let's say, a bunch of extra storm water, which has a bunch of nutrients that can help fuel algae blooms and also could bring in E. coli, and that's not great either. However, rain can also flush a lake and push out some of the bad material that's accumulated inside. When is that an optimal condition? When is that a suboptimal condition? All that stuff is important to. You may not need to understand exactly what's going on every single time, but just recognizing that it is a complex process. And that's why we talk about monitoring is not just this one-time item that you have to do, because there's significant variation that goes on. If you just took a snapshot in time, you could take a snapshot of the lake looking amazing, right? So right after the lake refilled from the dam repair, the lake generally looked pretty good. And that's very typical for lakes that, kind of fill in. Now, if you just said this is the state standard of Beaver Dam, that's one interpretation, but, many people on this board have been around for much longer, and that is more of an anomaly than the actual truth. So it's important to understand that. Monitoring helps us define what's normal-ish. I want to say that because normal every year is different. 2023, we had a ton of rain. We had the most rain we've had probably in 2 decades. So that's not necessarily a normal year. In 2021, we had a big drought, or 23, we had a big rain. 22, we had a relatively large drought in the summer.
That's right.
So that's not necessarily normal. So that's why, once again, we look at things over a longer period of time. Lake management is manipulating nature to suit human uses. That's kind of, I touched on that a little bit before. If we just cared about the ecology of the lake and just saying, all right, the lake's gonna do what we're gonna do, then we're happy with algae blooms. We're happy with filamentous algae. We're happy with excess aquatic plants, but that's not what lake management is. It's both of those things. So as long as humans and lakes coexist, which is what we're doing, there's always a need for management. This little figure I have here is basically just the process we go through generally when we're managing lakes. We're trying to define to the best of our ability what's normal, identify what is affecting the lake, implement a particular fix, but it doesn't stop there. You monitor that fix, you track the changes, see if it's worked, and kind of repeat the process over time. So this is what we're trying to most generally avoid in lakes. For anyone who's not familiar, these are, surface accumulations, and this top left-hand picture, this is actually a whole water column accumulation of a harmful algae bloom or a harmful cyanobacteria bloom. This is probably the most serious problem that many of these lakes face, unless there's a drinking water supply, and then there's some other things that we need to be worried about. But, you know, harmful algae blooms are one of the worst things we're dealing with. I mean, it is a national problem. Every lake has them. Beaver Dam Lake has had them in the past. And we want to do everything we can to avoid this state. Now, there's other things that affect lakes, right? Aquatic plant growth, increased sedimentation. However, in my experience, in my opinion, most lake homeowners would take excess aquatic plants over potentially harmful, toxic cyanobacteria blooms. Now, that doesn't mean you don't do anything about the plants. It doesn't mean the plants aren't an issue, but there is sort of a hierarchy in terms of what is tolerable, but also what you can realistically deal with very, relatively easily. Aquatic plant issues are difficult. I'm not trying to make light of them, dealing with it does take money and it does take time. But the harmful algae bloom issue is more of a whole systemic watershed issue that you deal with. So, going back to the beginning, this is the bumps in the trend, right? These are the conditions that we want to try and avoid.
And these are the larger bumps than plants.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Yeah, appreciate it. So we'll just quickly talk about Beaver Dam just to set the stage here. Honestly, a lot of this you're gonna know already. You've been on your lake more than I have. So a lot of this is gonna be relatively let's say review. It's about 164 acres. The big thing about Beaver Dam that I want everyone to keep in mind is that it's shallow. When lakes are shallow, they usually have a lot more issues. And you combine the shallowness of the lake with the fact that it's a reservoir and it dams up a river that drains a large portion of the upper Orange County area, Newburgh, New Windsor as well. That creates a lot of issues because we talked in the beginning all about sediment that maybe is flowing in a lake like Beaver Dam. It's exacerbated because you took a stream and you put a dam on it to whoever in the very beginning for whatever use it was. I don't remember if it's recreational. Some lakes get formed for industry. A lot of lakes in the Adirondacks got formed because of lumber. They were trying to move lumber down.
Well, there was a paper mill too.
It was,
Yeah.
there was a mill, yeah.
Both. Yeah, it was definitely.
Yeah, so they get formed for all these different reasons. But lakes that are shallow and that have large watersheds, and I should mention what a watershed is because I've talked about it a few times. Basically, think about a watershed like a bowl, right? So if you put a drop of water on the side of the bowl, it flows all the way down to the flat part of the bowl. The flat part of the bowl is your lake. The sloped ends of the bowl is all the land that feeds into the lake. Right, so this picture over here, this picture on the left, or I guess in the center, doesn't obviously look like a bowl, but the idea is that if a raindrop drops in any one of the sections that's inside of this white, in theory, that raindrop will eventually get to the lake. Now, in practice, it may get evaporated, it may get held by plants, but the idea is that if you have enough rain in a particular area, it will push into the lake. And that's, more importantly, it'll push into the streams and then into the lake. So once again, shallow lakes are important because they heat up very quickly and there's a lot of light that gets to the bottom. And as we'll see in the very next slide, light and heat are the two of the major drivers for a lot of this growth that we have.
Just to give you a breath too. One of the things that we don't ever mention, and it's funny, like even though as a resident, I know, but looking at the map, we never mentioned Route 84, you have an interstate that goes right through the watershed too. So not only is the tarmac draining from Stewart Airport, you also have an interstate, and whatever's driving over that, or whatever pulls on the side of the road, all those things can fall right into. Yeah, so there's a lot of human factors influence.
Yeah, and oftentimes, starting out, this is one of the first things I do with any lake that I go in is to kind of look at the watershed and kind of see what development is in the watershed. And, because that gives you an insight in terms of what the potential issues are gonna be in a lake. So I talked a little bit about light and heat, and I want to jump into this. So what causes these sort of algae blooms. And once again, I wanted to put this slide after the Beaver Dam because I wanted to have the context of, or the Beaver Dam, kind of background slide. Because I wanted to have the context of, once again, a shallow lake and a really, really large watershed, a lot of flow. So there's largely three sort of fuel sources, let's say, for harmful algae blooms, right? Those big green, discolorations, the accumulations of those cells that kind of blow down to the beach, and then they can close beaches and such. This is overly simplistic. There's a bunch of different macro and micronutrients that drive algae blooms between iron and manganese and silica and potassium as well. So there's a lot of nuance there. Fertilizers, which are mostly, they have a bunch of different of that. Light and heat, there's a lot of nuances there. The most important thing and kind of the takeaway message here is, by and large, you can't do anything really about light and heat. The sun is going to keep shining on the lake, and from that sun shining on the lake is going to keep heating up. And it's going to heat up throughout the summer, and it's going to cool down in the winter. There's small things on the margins you can do with light and heat. And we can talk about that in terms of some of the techniques we would potentially recommend to adopt, but by and large, you can't really do much about it. What you could do something about is the nutrients. This is basically the food for the algae. Now, as I mentioned, there's a bunch of different types of nutrients that are used by algae. Most often in lakes, it is phosphorus and it is nitrogen that grow. It's not one. It's not just phosphorus and it's not just nitrogen, it's both of them together. They both help build, build cell walls, they help with the biochemical process like if any biology, adenine triphosphate, it's the building blocks for all of life. So phosphorus and nitrogen are extremely important. One thing that's come up recently in the literature is that nitrogen is becoming more and more linked to the actual toxin production of cyanobacteria. So not just them growing, but the amount of toxins or the likelihood that they can produce toxins. So they're starting to see an increase linked with the amount of nitrogen. So normally what I would consider healthy lakes, I don't really like the term healthy. I think it's kind of oversimplistic, but I think for our purposes here, it'll work perfectly. And when I say healthy, what I mean is that a lake that can support all the uses that we want to use a lake for: swimming, fishing, boating. Normally you want to be under 20 micrograms per liter of phosphorus and around under 400 micrograms per liter of nitrogen, right? Those rules aren't hard and fast. We can talk about where maybe if you have less, you can still have blooms, or you can have more and you don't have blooms. But just think about it as a general number. So the next 3 slides we're going to talk about, if I have my order correct here, is looking at all the CSLAP data that we've collected over all the different years and seeing where Beaver Dam stacks in terms of this standard for what we consider to be healthy lakes. And of course, I put a different slide in the front, and this is fine. Before we jump into the actual data here, I want to kind of talk about the process of where this phosphorus and nitrogen could be coming from. And once again, we'll jump back to the actual numbers because it's important. But I was actually struggling to figure out where I wanted to put this in the talk because it's very important. But I decided I think this was the right spot to put it. So this is the model of the lake. This is a beautiful, beautiful lake we have here. Phosphorus and nitrogen come from a whole bunch of different places. They can come from septic systems. I know on Beaver Dam there are some septic systems, but it is mostly still on sewer. Obviously, it depends on where you are on the lake. Septic systems and on-site wastewater definitely contribute phosphorus and nitrogen to lakes. When that effluent leaves the house and enters the tank, it eventually enters a leach field, which the idea is it's supposed to filter in the leach field, and the soil and the bacteria are supposed to hold on and will break down those nutrients and kind of hold them right there. If you have an improperly functioning septic system, that doesn't happen. And either something's gonna happen where your water table rises to the level of the leach field, and you get something called short circuiting, which pushes all the effluent out. If you haven't changed that in your leach field in 30 years, your leach field could actually be at capacity and it can't hold any more phosphorus and it can push everything out. Nitrogen actually moves faster in the soil than phosphorus does, so septic systems, this is why they have such concerns about them on Cape Cod and Long Island, because it's all sand out there, and they can't hold any of the nitrogen and pushes it out into the lake, into the estuaries, and nitrogen drives a lot of algae blooms out in the coast. We also have stormwater. Every time it rains, instead of if it rains, you go outside, you see that chocolate milk flying down the road. All of that has a lot of phosphorus and nitrogen in it. That chocolate color that you see is most likely small silts and clays that are being moved by the water, and those have phosphorus and nitrogen on them. The other thing about stormwater is that they pick up everything that's on the road, the oils, the gases, the the byproducts from cars, anything like that gets picked up in stormwater and pushed down into the lake. So that is another big source of nutrients. And once again, it goes back to the core concept we were talking about in terms of the impact of our development on water bodies. Fertilizers, lawn practices, that is linked to stormwater, right? If you over fertilize and then you have a storm come off, that's going to push the excess fertilizer there. You also have stuff in the atmosphere. Once again, can't do much about that. Geese, birds, waterfowl. In a lot of large lakes, they're usually not a large source, but they definitely can be. Their feces do have a lot of phosphorus and nitrogen in them. And all of that can fuel algae blooms. Now, the secondary process I want to talk about here, this is important, this once again goes back to the shallow nature of the lake, is that algae is constantly growing and dying in the lake, no matter what. Even if you didn't do any algae treatment in the lake, algae is constantly dying, and then they release the nutrients, and then different algae uptake that nutrients, and it's just this constant cycle. It's happening right now outside the door. Now, in the summertime, a lot of this algae starts to float down to the bottom of the lake. And when it floats down to the bottom of the lake, you get this phenomenon called a zone of no oxygen. You've heard about the dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico or anything like that. And basically what's happening is that lakes are sitting on a balance of photosynthesis and respiration. You have plants that are producing oxygen, you have bacteria, fish that are consuming oxygen. So every lake is sitting on that, and that scale tips depending on the time of day. Early in the morning, you have more respiration. Later on, when you have a bunch of algae, you have more photosynthesis. So it tips between having a lot of oxygen and having no oxygen, or lower oxygen. Now at the bottom of the lake, it is dark, it is cold, there's no photosynthesis going on there. There's not really any plants growing down there, there's no algae. So you get that really large tip towards high respiration. And then from the respiration, that consumes oxygen and creates this zone of no oxygen. Why is that important? Why do we care about that? We don't care about what's going on the very bottom of the lake. And the surface is what we care about because we swim in it, right? We swim in the surface. The problem is that when you have no oxygen, it creates a chemically reducing environment, which releases a bunch of nutrients, the same nutrients that would potentially come in through stormwater, potentially come in through septics in some cases, right into the water column. And this phenomenon is called internal loading. You have no oxygen, reduction reactions happen in the bottom of the lake. It pushes all this stuff into the lake. Now, the shallow nature of Beaver Dam Lake is a problem for this, because normally if you had a really deep lake, a lot of these nutrients would just stay in the bottom. It would stay in the bottom until November, when the lake started to turn over again. Yeah, you may get a little bit of spike at the end of November, but who cares? It's the end of November, nobody's swimming there, it's not a big deal. You care if you're a drinking water supplier, but that's a different story. But at the shallow nature, when these nutrients come out of the bottom, it's available for algae growth immediately, because the algae, it's right there for them. And even if it's not right there for them, the cyanobacteria can actually drop themselves down into the bottom waters, grab those nutrients, and then come back up. They can also do something called luxury uptake, where they say, hey, we have plenty of phosphorus out here. Instead of just using it all for growth, I'm going to store it in a different cell compartment. It's called a polyphosphate bond. And I'll use it for a later time. So if the lake becomes nutrient poor, I can have a little bit more. It's basically just having like a lunch pail with you, just going in and just pulling it out instead of just going to the store. So there's a lot of these different things that these algae can do. So it's important to consider that when it comes to Beaver Dam. We're going to jump back into this a little bit when we talk about the bathymetry. But basically the point of this is just showing that there's different sources of nutrients out here, but it's not just what's coming in the watershed, it's also what's being generated inside. So jumping into some of the data, the next three graphs you're gonna see are basically the same. On the x-axis, you have the number of years, and this is all the CSLAP data. So every single one of these data points was collected by you, which is pretty awesome, if you ask me. What I have here are sort of the optimal and the threshold values for each of these different parameters. We're gonna start with total phosphorus. And the idea here is that if you're below the blue line, you are in great condition. This is your Lake Georges, right? These are your lakes that almost never have any algae blooms. If you're above the red line, you're in trouble. This is where you're gonna be at really high risk of producing a lot of different algae in the lake, and most likely it's gonna be cyanobacteria. So unfortunately, as you can see, throughout all the different years that the data has been collected, and despite significant variation, as you can see, some of these numbers really vary from, being close to 140 to like 55, let's say in 2008, it's all above the red line. And this has been the case for a while now. So Beaver Dam has a lot of phosphorus that's in the lake that can fuel algae blooms. And sort of unsurprisingly, right? There's a really, really large watershed that's out there. The internal load, which we'll talk about in a little bit with the bathymetry, that's definitely contributing some. There's some data I didn't show from the bottom, which has a lot of phosphorus coming out of the bottom. So a lot of phosphorus in the surface water. So at least one of the nutrients, there's a ton of, to supply algae. We have total nitrogen. A few numbers that sit in that, between the optimal value, but basically the same. Basically, throughout all the years and throughout all this different variation, really, really high numbers. 1,000 micrograms per liter is where you start to see, and this is an interesting anecdote, the aquatic plant community. Anecdotally, in my experience, once you get to that 1,000 microgram per liter number, you start to get a lot of filamentous algae, a lot of duckweed. I've seen this on multiple different lakes, and that's pretty much the dominant aquatic plant community outside of Eurasian water milfoil in Beaver Dam. A lot of floating filamentous algae, it's a lot of that duckweed. So it actually starts to affect the aquatic plant community. One thing I want you to note as well is within each year, there's a lot of variation between these points, which goes back to the point where you can't just monitor at one particular time, because one particular time if you can see my cursor here, you could get this sample and say, wow, look, we're doing great. This is great. Or you can get all the way up here and say, wow, the sky is falling, So it's important to, once again, have those multiple years of data and also multiple data points in season to understand it.
Are these data points most likely chronological, like as it climbs, as they go later into the year, or are they random?
The sampling frequency, is it depending, like is the bottom one, the first reading, and the top one, the last reading in September?
Because there's 8 points.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I don't have that graph.
From reading the C stuff, you would need to look at year by year to be able to see where the plot points are, but you would think that earlier in the year would be the lower, and then later in the summer would be the higher ones.
But it may not be some years.
Yes,
A lot of it's
so
temperature
that is, it's a great question, and it gets back to the internal load. If you have a lake where that's specific scenario you just said, where it's low in the spring and the early summer, and it increases as the season goes on, it's in surface water. To me, that's a telltale sign that there's a bunch of nutrients being released, because normally in the summer, I say normal, like 2023 was a normal year, but normally you don't have as much precipitation and rain in that summer period outside of the hurricanes that happen. Most of your snow melts happening earlier in the spring, you have higher flows, pushing more things into the lake. So you should see usually a higher number in the spring, and then it drops out a little bit. And then depending on the weather you have for the year, it can either kind of flatten out or it can come up. If it starts to come up during the summer and you don't have a lot of rain, where is those nutrients coming from?
We've seen a lot of this last year with the clarity readings.
Yeah.
And we can only go by our first reading for this year was phenomenal clarity. But last year, right from the beginning, and it increasingly reduced all the way to September.
Yeah,
So it was a really bad clarity year, and I think a lot of that has to do with the nutrient buildup producing filamentous and other types of algae, which will block the sunlight from going down.
Yes, yes, and that's a problem in lakes in the spring. So one question I get a lot is, if if we have a wet spring, are we gonna have a good summer? Or if we have a dry spring, are we gonna have a good summer? There's not a great way to answer that question. There's so many different, yeah, there's so many different variables. But one thing I will say about that though, is that if you have a lot of inflow in the spring into your lake, as you said, in terms of the algae blocking light,
Right.
is that when you have lower clarity, all those particles in the water, they attenuate light and they absorb heat at the very surface.
Sure.
So you actually, the lake stratifies, which we haven't talked about stratification, but it creates the distinct layers
Right.
earlier than it would normally create them. Especially if you have a spring followed by a bunch of hot days early, which is kind of what we had this year. Then you can get that stratification that sets up earlier and that internal load can start earlier. So that definitely happens. So last one I would jump into is chlorophyll A. We look at chlorophyll A. Chlorophyll A is a pigment produced by algae, and for the purposes of lake management, it's a great surrogate for the amount of algae in the lake. So the higher the number is, and the higher the data is in the y-axis there, the more algae that's in the lake. That's a good way to think about it. Once again, we have our optimal and threshold values. They're kind of tight together here. Usually, and probably say optimal is maybe closer to 2 micrograms per liter, or we have it sitting at 5, but 5 is still a pretty good number. Once again, the same story with the phosphorus and nitrogen. It is high throughout all the different years, and also you have some, once again, some pretty significant variation.
Interesting.
So all these graphs, are really pointing us to the conclusion that, Beaver Dam is not in a great place when it comes to the amount of nutrients in the lakes. There's plenty of nutrients to fuel algae blooms and fuel sustained blooms over time. So I want to quickly switch gears just a little bit here and talk about some of the volunteer data we've collected this year. And almost done, I got a few more slides left. So Chris and the board was gracious enough to support a hybrid volunteer monitoring of the inflow and tributaries. So we have great data in the lake. We still need to collect a little bit more in some different parameters, but we have a really good understanding of what's going on in the lake. We don't really know what's going on in the watershed. There's never really been any testing of the watershed, figuring out which streams may be high in certain nutrients, also E. coli. So we decided, in the beginning to kind of start out, can we test some of these streams to see how high the phosphorus levels are? How do they sort of compare to what we've seen in the past? So we did 3 rounds of sampling. I say we, but really, Chris and the crew did three rounds of sampling. And going out to each stream, jumping in the stream, collecting phosphorus, nitrogen, and E. coli. For the interest of time, I'm going to leave the E. coli out of this. It doesn't mean it's not important, but we're going to just stick to the nutrients. And what we have here is just a map of the different sample areas that we took samples at. And this legend here on the bottom left-hand corner is basically just a scale. If you're from 0 to 20, you're doing pretty good. If you're from 21 to 50 in a stream setting, you're not doing great. And then if you're above 50, it's really, really high. So as you can see, every single sampling, at least during August 24th, this is 2023 date, everything is high. And if you look at these numbers on the bottom right-hand corner, they're actually pretty similar to what we're seeing in the lake. So you have some 91, 85, 77, 88.2. Really, really high. So we can just go back really quickly, that's this range here. So higher than kind of, I guess we would calculate sort of the mean value would be, but somewhat relatively in line. And that sort of is, that's kind of a line of evidence to say, the watershed is affecting what's going on in the lake. If the watershed had really, really low nutrients coming in and the lake was really, really high, or vice versa, maybe there's something else going on here. But it makes sense. It's a large watershed, a lot of water is pushing through. The water quality in the streams is going to somewhat reflect the water in the lake itself.
What is the BW6? Where is that?
Yeah, so
Brittany.
yeah, so BW6 is Brittany Terrace.
We can see the next sample.
Yeah, it's down, this is downstream from DEC permitted wastewater discharge from the community. So we wanted a sample here because anytime there's some sort of a wastewater discharge in the community, it's always a red flag, not because they're doing anything wrong, right? We're not saying they are or they aren't, but it's usually putting in a bunch of nutrients. Part of the issue with that is most of the state limits that they put on wastewater discharges are not protective enough for lakes. We're talking about this 90 and 100 number that's in the lakes, and we say 20 is the number we want to kind of stay at.
Right.
A lot of the permits are at 1,000. And that could be at the lower end. And some of the lowest ones you can even get to with advanced treatment is like 100. So, you know, the scale of the amount of the concentration of nutrients matters when it comes to wastewater treatment. So we always want to look at those sort of areas. So obviously that was very, very high during that time. Moving down again to September 25th, very, very high, but it changes, right? You know, we didn't have that really, really high nutrient number at 6, but we had some high numbers we had some high numbers at 3. One of these was actually during a rainstorm.
Yeah.
This one was during a rainstorm as well. So all the sites kind of got higher, once again, outside of 6. And then, oh, sorry, I double dated this. So this is actually November 7th. My apologies there. And you can see this, you know, while BLW6 is higher, most of the streams ran a little bit lower, but once again, it's still pretty high. I mean, you really want to be, in your inflowing streams, you really want them to be at the same concentration you want your lake to be at. That's like the optimal view of it. And this I would still say is very elevated. The nitrogen data showed basically the same patterns here, higher in rainstorm, very, very high, averaging about, you know, that 1,000 micrograms per liter, that number we talked about a little bit before. So this is a really, really important stepping stone. We didn't have any of this information before. In our future sampling, we're going to be building on this. And the idea, especially with the E. coli, is to potentially work with the health department to see if there's any ways that we can actually move to some implementable fixes. Is there a way that maybe we can work with the Whitney Terrace folks to, you know, talk about the way that they're treating their wastewater, maybe help them even get some grant money to deal with that particular that issue, because that issue, you know, then getting a wastewater treatment plant that's got a higher standard only benefits Beaver Dam, because it's the downflow water, and that goes with any sort of land use that's happening in the watershed. You know, it's a partnership. This isn't a blame game. This is you know, we're all sort of in this together. Last thing I'll talk about here is the bathymetric survey we did. Basically, bathymetry is the study of basically the morphometry and the contours of lakes. So simple questions: how deep is the lake? And the way we did this is we used a commercial grade fish finder, and we drove these transects up and down the lake, and we put it into this fancy program that gives us outputs in terms of the sonar usage, and creates these basically heat maps. And we pull the heat maps into a program. We do something called an interpolation, where we guess between the points, what's the depth, and we put it all together into one image. And this is the image here. So this is the bathymetry of Beaver Dam Lake. So as you can see on this map, the darker the colors, the deeper the lake, or the deeper the water depth is in this particular time. Deepest we found was, I think, around 28 feet-ish, right around the dam, right around the dam area, which makes perfect sense. There's a lot more to go into the bathymetry, but for the sake of our conversation and time, most importantly, I want you to focus on the center here, where actually the text of Beaver Dam Lake is. The entire center of the lake is about 13 feet, at least 13 feet deep. It varies a little bit, but most of that lake is that 13-foot zone. And we have this graph here, which I'll talk about in the next slide. It's an area at depth curve. So the majority is why is 13 feet important? The aquatic plants in Beaver Dam Lake don't grow, at least as of last year, don't grow further than about 7 feet of water. So from 7 feet all the way to 25 feet, it's bare muck, basically. It changed a little bit. Some places are sand, a little sandier, some places are more silty, more organic. But it's basically all mud. So that internal loading that I was talking about, way when I was talking about all the different sources, that happens most often at the bottom when there's that sort of muckling. So all of this area that is below, I would consider honestly below 10 feet, or maybe, to be kind of conservative about it. All of that is producing that excess nutrients that are coming up from the bottom. That entire area is, is what we call loading, pushing all that up. And that varies throughout the year. For example, if Beaver Dam Lake had a lot lower phosphorus and a lot lower nitrogen, you'd probably only get that production in this very, very small area by the dam, because it starts at the deeper end and it gets shallower as it goes out. But we know from some past profile data and some other information that this area does have no oxygen in the summer. So to me, this is a really, really big issue. The fact that it's basically almost half the lake area that is able to produce this excess nutrients is a big deal. And also it's shallow, so it gets light and it gets heated up faster than the deeper waters do. So once again, we have that sort of three-legged stool, that trifecta, the light, heat, nutrients. Beaver Dam is really hitting all three of them, unfortunately. So basically just kind of reiterating what we talked about before. This is the hypsographic curve. Basically it looks at the relationship between the lake, the surface area and the depth of the lake. The big takeaway here is, as you can see, most of the area in a lake is very shallow. So, going down the line, this is the total surface area, about 164 acres. We know that there's 164 acres of lake that's at least has like 1 foot of water, right? And as you go further down, you get smaller and smaller areas. But as you can see, I mean, once we get to 10 feet here, there's still 80 acres of water that's 10 feet or less. It's another way to show that the lake is really, really shallow. And a lot of the times we term this sort of lake of unfortunate depth. In some scenarios, it actually would probably, there would be some benefits if the lake was, in theory, right? If the lake was like 4 feet deep. Because what you would do is you would flush the lake probably constantly. So all these rainstorms, while you would still, you would,
Bathtub.
yeah, exactly. You would be, you still, you would still get a lot of algae, you would still have a lot of that stuff, but all those rainstorms would be able to push stuff out. And, rain would actually be a relatively good thing for the lake. But the fact that you're deeper than that, but you're not so deep, and you have all this like capacity, and it takes a long time to warm up. Like once again, in Lake George, a lot of the reason why these pristine like Adirondack lakes are in the condition that they are, one, because of the watershed, and two, they're so deep, they have so much volume, they can take more punishment in terms of like what comes in from the watershed.
Can I give you a breath?
Yeah.
Question. I was on the lake board many years ago. We were talking about aerators, which is no good because it creates growth. How about circulators? Solar circulators.
So are you
So
talking?
move the stagnant there, because stagnation is what the growth is.
Yeah, so are you referring to like on the shoreline or in the?
Yeah, well, wherever you can, but the shoreline basically.
Yeah, so there's a lot
You
of.
have some dead zones there with Fred and Larry live.
Yeah, so there's a lot of people that use circulators to kind of push algae or duckweed off of their immediate area. For pushing it off, it's fine. You're gonna need a lot of effort to push it out.
Yeah.
It's not doing anything for the oxygen. It has to do with the physics of the way that oxygen gets transferred from that movement. So one of the ways that oxygen gets into the water in general is that the wind comes in and creates contact with the atmosphere. And that's basically the same thing that's happening with one of these circulators. But it's just not that efficient, and it doesn't move like laterally out. And I think it's important because there's a lot of lakes that try these large circulation systems where they put like, it's basically like an air stone from a fish tank on a massive scale, and they put them in the bottom of the lake and they bubble them up, and they can work in some instances. But the problem is the transfer efficiency isn't great. So you can get some oxygen that increases, but that very bottom layer is still going to be have no oxygen, and it can create issues, but no, it's a good question, because it comes up a lot. So last slide here, or last two slides, so how are we moving forward from this, right? You know, we painted kind of a kind of a little bit of a doom and gloom picture, you know. Beaver Dam is not in a great place in terms of its phosphorus, its nitrogen, the chlorophyll A, it's producing a ton of algae. We know there's at least a large portion of it that's coming from the watershed. And we know there's a large portion coming from the inside of the lake itself. So what do we do with this information? The way I would see it is that there's sort of three large general kind of questions we need to answer over the next few years to be able to get to a point where we can actually look to reduce these nutrients that are in the lakes. First of all, what's the major source of nutrients entering Beaver Dam? Is it stormwater? Is it septic? Is it the internal load? Most likely it's a combination
The
of them.
answer is yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's important. They're all gonna be contributing. The reason why I say major source is because a lot of funding a lot of funding is linked to identifying the major sources of nutrients, and then state agencies are more willing to give money to groups that are able to identify that. You do that through a nutrient budget, through processes called the TMDLs, all that sort of stuff. There's a lot of nuance in there as well. The importance of each of them changes, right? If you have a really dry year, the internal load becomes more important. If you have a really, really wet year, the stormwater may become more important, and the septic maybe, it does bounce around. But trying to generally answer that question is a very important. And also too, it's good for, like, you know, talking to, you know, different lawmakers and legislators saying, hey, we did an analysis of the lake. Let's just say stormwater is on average is our biggest issue. You know, we have identified X amount of projects that we believe that can help reduce that stormwater to this particular amount. Can you help us? Versus saying, oh, we think stormwater is a big deal, so help us out. Like, that's not a great sort of argument. It's kind of just like, all right, yeah, we know it's an issue, but what's the actual, what's the proportion of it? And then I'm going to jump to the third point here, but if we do these projects, where does it actually get us?
Exactly.
That's the other kind of important part. Also, how can we realistically and financially support projects, as we kind of mentioned? You know, lake management's expensive. You know, I mentioned before in the very beginning, no lake gets fixed with limited monitoring data. No lake gets fixed with limited budgets. And that's not for me to say, oh, dues need to go up a whole bunch amount, or,
Right.
you know, all that stuff, but it's just the reality of the scale of the problem we do. It took decades and decades to develop the watershed in the way that it did, to you know, build Stewart International, to put Little Britain Elementary School, to put all these roads in, to put Jackson Avenue and all the drainages, to put 84 in. All that stuff took decades to do. You can't just reverse it in a year or two or three. It's just the problem, especially on something like Beaver Dam. It's not a simple problem. So that's why I said that's the realism of it, right? And the realism also goes into the fact that, once again, you're not Lake George, you're not this pristine water body that has the Adirondack Park protecting its.
And it never was.
it-
That's the thing that I
Yeah.
always want to say, is that it never was.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, you know, understanding that, and obviously financial, you know, full lake oxygenation systems can cost you upwards of 6 figures, anywhere from, you know, roughly $120,000, $250,000, not including, you know, operation and maintenance costs, nutrient inactivants that potentially could be available in the next few years in a lake like this. Once again, you're going into 6 figures, large stormwater retrofits in terms of like large scale with design, construction costs, permitting. You're in your 300,000, 400,000, 500,000. Larger things like connecting more people to sewer lines, that now you're starting to get into the $1 million range. This is all expensive, you know, and so it's important to understand. It's not to say, oh my God, we can never do that, right? There's ways to do it. There's bonds, there's grant opportunities. It's not to say it's out of the reach, but it's important to understand that this is, you know, this is the world we live in. There's no scenario where you reduce a budget and the lake just magically it gets better because of something you did. It's just lake management just really doesn't work like that. So that's kind of the general framework. We have some more specific ideas of how we want to move forward in terms of the different analysis, the different stuff we want to do in terms of implementing some of the changes. The last thing I want to leave you with is actually, something that everyone can do. This is, it's important to talk about because, when we're living on a lake, lake is a community. Everything that happens on your particular property and your parcel affects everyone. The water is circulating constantly throughout the lake. If your septic system isn't functioning properly, or your stormwater management in your property is not great, it's not an isolated issue that stays with you. It affects everyone. So everyone needs to sort of have a community, understanding that, if you work on your property, it's gonna help everyone else. So just a quick example when it comes to, rain and runoff. Inspect your property, look for places where water runs freely. If you have a swale that keeps you getting really chocolate milky on the, every time it rains, maybe that's a place to start. Or your gutters, for example, are your gutters going directly onto your driveway and then pushing all the way down onto the lake? Or are they kind of getting spread out? Are they going into some sort of a rain garden or just some sort of a vegetated area? All those little things matter. Thinking about different ways that your property, the impervious surface happens on your property. So instead of maybe just paving the entire section of your property, could you put some porous pavers at the end? Could you do a patio that's maybe porous? Like, all those small things are important to think about as well. Limiting fertilizer use close to the lake, that's very important. A lot of the new fertilizers are much better than they used to be. There was a phosphorus ban a few decades ago on fertilizer, but nitrogen is still in them. For fertilizer, it's important to use slow release fertilizer formulations. Because if you get the fast release stuff, a rainstorm just washes it all out. Slow release, a larger percentage of the plants uptake the nitrogen on a slow release versus some of the other fertilizers. So that's very important. Also, if at all possible, refrain from altering the shoreline as much. I know everyone wants this beautiful beach that's all the way down the lake where everyone can hang out, but a few plants aren't the worst thing. Thinking about, lakescaping, you don't want this massive green lawn all running all the way down to the lake. That's just an invitation for excess nutrients to get in. Really, the name of the game when it comes to your individual properties is for water. You want to slow it down, you want to infiltrate it. It needs to get in the ground as fast as possible. Because the ground is the best filter you're going to be able to buy with this kind of stuff. So one last thing that's not on here that I'll leave you with is if you're having construction happening on your house, if you're redoing your septic system, if you're redoing your lawn, if you're digging up your driveway, take it upon yourselves to think about the erosion control that's happening. If there's not a silt fence in an area where there's a slope and there's a bunch of sediment, you probably should ask your contractor to put up a silt fence. Ask them to tarp unconsolidated sediments that are just sitting there. All that stuff is really, really important. So that's all. I know I talked for a while here, but I wanted to make sure we got a nice comprehensive view of everything. And if I have any time, I'll take any questions.
Very good points. I'm just noticing all the comments people are giving on the
Yeah,
side.
any comments here first?
Yeah, and we can hold these to the end.
AJ, the one thing I have, and it's been near and dear to my heart for a long time, and a lot of it we can't control, is the use of agents to tie up the nutrients, which New York in its infinite wisdom is not allowing.
Yeah.
Alum or Foslock or things like that. Now, in your opinion, since there is so much coming in on the tributaries that are feeding the lake, we have the internal loading and we have external loading.
Yeah.
Even if they were to allow us to use something like alum, which locks up the phosphorus, drops it down to the sediment, we're still going to be getting the external loading coming in. Is this going to, once this stuff is used, does it get used up and then go down to the bottom? or does most of it get flushed out with going over the dam or whatever the case may be?
Yeah, so Fred's referring to, there's a bunch of different products and they're really minerals and elements that are good at binding phosphorus and and keeping
Not
phosphorus. So,
lithium, lanthanum.
so there's lanthanum, there's aluminum,
Right.
iron does the same thing. But really what we're talking about is alum and lanthanum. And
Mhm.
a lot of lakes across the United States have used alum and lanthanum and actually put them in lakes. And they bind the phosphorus, and most importantly, when there's no oxygen on the bottom, they keep the phosphorus. Part of the reason why that phosphorus comes out of the bottom is because it bounds iron, and then when there's no oxygen.
And
the
you
bond
also have
breaks.
the sulfur.
And the sulfur, which competes with them. I forgot you got a chemistry background. I keep forgetting that. So a lot of lakes have used this to great success all across the country. As Fred said, we don't have to get into it now, but New York is not there in terms of allowing. To your particular question, that material, if it's treated on the sediment, what it'll do is it'll slowly sink into the bottom of the sediment.
Right.
And if there's a bunch of alum or lanthanum that hasn't been bound to phosphorus, it'll just keep binding in the bottom of the sediment, but it will get buried over time.
Okay,
It will get buried over time. So my gut feeling is that a lake like Beaver Dam, the longevity of a treatment varies from like 5 years to almost 20 years of good control. For Beaver Dam, you're probably closer to the 5 years just because you have so much water flow that's coming in. Now, if we ever get to that point where that's an option, we have to kind of talk about, hey, 5 years is great. If we could get 5 years of really good water quality out of this, obviously depending on the price,
and
depending on
if
the
you look at
permitting.
the fact that, yes, this stuff is expensive,
Yeah,
but if it can be, if it can reduce your Band-Aid treatments that are required in the absence of this,
yeah,
the old saying is, it could partially pay for itself.
it could. There's a scenario where that's the case.
Okay.
Yeah, once again, lakes have a way, if we had 4 more rain years, that 5-year window that I mentioned could actually be through.
Yeah.
So, any next,
Copper sulfate, we used to treat it many years ago
yeah,
to kill all the fibrous things.
Yeah.
and plants.
so.
That takes out all the oxygen, doesn't it?
So the copper sulfate itself doesn't take out the oxygen, it's, what happens is, and now this is really restricted to like farm ponds,
Yeah.
right? So on these small ponds, what would happen back in like the 50s and 60s is, they would just treat the entire pond. And it would knock everything out, and then everything is decomposing, everything dies off, all the oxygen gets consumed, and then you get a fish kill.
Exactly.
Yeah, on a big lake like this, you're not really concerned with that. You can only treat 50% of the water column with, at any point with the DEC. So it really doesn't happen.
We should do just the perimeter.
Yeah, so that's not a real particular concern. The bigger issue I have with algaecide treatments, is it's so hard to predict how long the impacts will last.
What happened?
Because you cannot predict weather. So you can have a treatment in the best conditions, it could last for 2 weeks. But if it's minimal, if you have bad conditions, let's say you have a lot of rain and then followed up by some like 90-degree days, you could be right back where you are in 3 or 4 days. And it's very hard to know when that's the case. Now, that doesn't mean you don't use it as a tool, but it's important to understand that if you put it in, you can't guarantee that you're not gonna have a bloom in 3 days. It's the nature.
Now, correct me on one thing. At a nice folder many years ago, I heard that the nutrient uptake is generally the aquatic plants will prefer the nutrient over the production of algae. And that if you destroy all the plants, you're going to get more nutrient being used to form algae. And this is where I kind of question the use of these sterile carp,
Yeah.
which tend to not only go after your milfoils and your other things, go after the good plants also.
Yeah.
And if those plants are destroyed, your nutrient is still there.
Yeah.
Not to mention what the fish poop, but
And you
the
can't
nutrient,
guarantee they're sterile.
well, besides that, but yes, you're right.
And you have another problem.
You're going to have, this nutrient has to get used for something.
Yeah.
And generally, you're going to increase your algae formation.
Yeah. No, you're exactly right. A lot of that research actually came out of Sweden and Denmark. We've learned a lot about lakes from Denmark and the Netherlands, because they have a lot of these really, really, really shallow lakes, like 1,000 acres and 3 feet deep. You
Wow.
know, these really shallow ones, and what they do is that. Maybe because of carp, sometimes because of other things, they switch between having a bunch of plants and having no plants. And when they have no plants, they have no place to uptake the nutrients, as you said, and it's used by algae. Over here, it's a little bit more nuanced because you have deep zones where plants will just never grow. So every lake is different in terms of the relative importance of plants. In terms of grass carp, unless it's a very specific situation in the Northeast, I'm not a big fan of them. I think they're a sledgehammer when you really only need a mallet. You know, harvesting herbicides, diver harvesting, I consider those mallets because you can control where they go. If you want to treat in a certain area, you can treat in that area. If you want to harvest in a certain area, you can harvest in an area. When you put grass carp in, they go everywhere and they.
Like we did
Right.
with water chestnuts
Yeah.
a few years ago. We had one area that was quite loaded with it,
Yeah.
and we hand harvested. And it
Yeah.
pretty much eliminated the problem.
Yeah. Now, there are some, you know, down south, when they have the massive reservoirs that have like 5,000 acres of hydrilla or an invasive species. Grass carp are a more viable tool. Those reservoirs also don't really have an aquatic plant community.
And they can be contained.
Yes, but the containment is less of an issue, more of just like the scale of the problem, because
Okay.
you just can't pay, you know. To treat 5,000 acres of plants is close to $1 million when you put everything in it. You know, grass carp are $25 a fish, so they are cheaper, you know, but to me, they're much more of a. Are there any chat questions?
Yeah, there are some chat comments.
Sure.
But are there questions?
Uh,
Comments are more for,
Yeah. And there's some things we can't do anything about.
It looks like it's just comments rather than questions, from what I'm looking at.
That train is on the station.
Yeah.
You know, bear in mind that the cost of what's being talked about here is already incorporated into your taxes. It's part of the budget that we do every single year. So we have to have a delicate balance between what we can spend and what we can accomplish. We don't want to raise people's taxes by $1,000 per year.
well, don't say numbers like that because we are not even anywhere near that.
Right.
So,
I'm just saying,
Not speaking to the universe.
this is already incorporated into your taxes.
We're talking about dollars.
So we're, you know, because it's divided by 850 homes. But the idea is that while AJ is here as a representative, which, by the way, we've searched him out over a long period of time to find a lake management company. So it's a blessing for us to have him here with us. But we throw money at it, but it's already in your budget. So it's not like we're talking about an additional expense. This is just informative to say, look, we've got these things in place already. Here's an expert. Here's what our recommendations are.
Yeah, and something, and coming from AJ, something that I've just thrown at a few meetings that we are looking for grant writing help. And we certainly want to apply for these large grants, that would be this board's main focus to get as much resources.
So is there something, AJ, that you could help us with regarding this nutrient level that's coming in? And I know the E. coli is a totally different animal, pardon the pun. As far as the nutrient that's coming in, if we say, oh, yeah, it's loaded, it's coming in, what can we do about it?
Yeah, well, I think, with the watershed, it's very complicated because there's some things that are in your control, there's some things that aren't. You know, there are multiple towns, multiple jurisdictions that are responsible for the upkeep of the land that is up there, right? And you know, some may want to play ball, some may not when it comes to this. And that's the reality. A lot of this is sort of people management. My large, long-term suggestion for this, just in general, is keep talking about the importance of this, because the more connections you make, and you know, it sounds kind of cliche, but it is very important to kind of build those bridges, because you know, let's say we identify a stormwater project we want to do further up in the watershed, we need a grant for it. Getting letters of support from all the different towns that understand that, hey, you know, Beaver Dam Lake is serious about helping to fix this, you know, we want to take a leadership role. All that stuff is very important. It all helps us, you know, score you up higher in the grant, get that kind of stuff done. You know, in terms of individual stuff, you know, talking to the specific towns about enforcing the stuff that's already on the books in terms of, inspection for construction and, like one easy one is like catch basin cleaning and that sort of stuff. You'd be surprised the amount of towns that, and they get busy, right? Highway departments get very busy. They're oftentimes understaffed for what they need to be able to do. But sometimes catch basin cleaning gets, it gets kicked down the road. So just reminding them, hey, this is something that's very important to us, and all those sorts of things are
Are
extremely.
floating islands proven to be effective for something like this, or is it really a waste of money?
I think floating islands are, for nutrient management,
Yeah,
are a waste of money.
okay,
They look nice, they can improve the aesthetics of an area, they can attract wildlife. All that stuff is fine. If you're putting them in to clean the lake up, the efficiencies are not there.
okay. Thank you.
So if I may, just for interest of time, if anybody has any further questions, please email the board, and we can get those questions to AJ. And
Is
then
there
we
anything
can-
we haven't addressed? In the-
Yeah, and I mean, that's the thing, like, if you, just anybody that's paid attention to the meetings in the last year, many of these questions have come up before. It's awesome to have AJ here, as long as he's able to sit here, and if anybody's gonna stay on and just keep going, I'm pretty sure we could get some really great questions answered. But yeah, once again, bdlboard@gmail.com, of course, .org, sorry.
.org.
And ask us any questions, and we can certainly relay them to AJ. I guess just one question I'd like to ask,
Sure.
increasing our sample locations for the tributaries, because that's for the rest of this year. I mean, we want to resume our program. Yes. Are we interested in doing the same places also, or to expand it to multiple locations, or abandon and go to brand new places? Is there any reason to do both, or?
I would say at this point, we probably want a little bit more data at the same places. We have pretty good spatial coverage. There are some areas that would be interesting, a little bit south of Stewart International Airport.
Sure.
So higher up.
Yeah, like south of Crestview, but I would put those. I would put those at a little bit less priority than just getting more monitoring results at the same areas, because then we're building that confidence in those numbers. The other thing you could do too is get more wet and dry samples, because those are both very important. For example, for E. coli, dry samples are, because if you get a high hit of E. coli with a dry sample, that's most likely an illicit discharge of some sort.
Yeah.
Or a freak accident where like 15 geese decided to go to the bathroom in the nice spot right above where you were. But it is, usually in health departments look out for this. Health departments look out for high E. coli or fecal coliform in those dry periods. But wet's important because wet's a more realistic insight into the loading that's happening into a lake. A lot of times with stormwater on an annual basis, most of the stuff that comes in is coming from those big 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch, above inch rainstorms. So
That would give us leverage for grants too, wouldn't it?
yeah, and that's the idea, is to sort of build the database and say, hey, it's not like we just went to dip the bottle one time and said, oh, it's high. We actually have a repository of
Sure.
information.
Yeah.
Like same thing you have with the sea slug data.
Yeah.
Build that repository. So I would say more priority on getting more samples, but then also, varying wet and dry. There's other things too we can talk about as we learn more about the watershed. Do we want to add different analytes, to it? We're just testing phosphorus and nitrogen and E. coli, but do we want to talk about PFAS? Do we want to talk about SVOCs, like any of those other ones?
It's a real
That's a very complicated thing, because the cost to do that is very expensive, and we need to make sure we're looking for exactly what we want to look for in that, but those are the sort of things that I would recommend there. And once again, I just mentioned for the E. coli, this is something we're working with the health department right now. So this isn't just a scenario where we're just collecting and we're waiting, until we have all this data and then we're moving. We're engaging with the health department, talking with them, seeing if we can get them to work with us on this. Once again, it goes back to that short term and the long term, right? You need to do both, so.